Welcome to the most important week of the year for the podcast industry. Welcome to Podcast Movement 2025.
Thank you for coming, everybody. We are very excited to present what we think is an industry first. I think with the rise of simulcasting, which we'll get into, there's a big question on performance. How do these YouTube views compare to these podcast downloads? How should we treat them? So we're going to dive into that today.
Whoops. Sorry, Pete.
And to kick things off, I'm Pete Birsinger, the founder and CEO of Podscribe. And we have Giles.
And I'm Giles Martin, the EVP of Strategy at Oxford Road.
So this together has been a collaboration between us where we've helped pull some data and Giles has helped to analyze it and pull some data as well. So, all right, so let's get into it. So who here, with a show of hands, knows what the term simulcasting means?
Bravo.
All right, pretty good crew. So for the sake of a definition, what we call a simulcast is when a podcast posts the same episode to their RSS feed and to either their YouTube channel or playlist. And as probably most of you know, this has been getting very popular recently. So we just wanted to put a quick chart here to illustrate how common this actually is right now. So if we look at all the campaigns that we at Podscribe have tracked over the past year, what we found is of all those campaigns that are an episodic campaign, the amount that are simulcasts that have both podcast downloads and YouTube views has gone up and to the right. So you can see there's been a pretty steady and clean trend. So simulcasting just continues to rise and rise. And yeah, that is data from this summer. So the trend is sticking with us. And of those simulcasts, so we did actually an exercise. So YouTube puts out a list, the YouTube top 100 podcasts, what they consider to be the top shows based on their data. So we went in and looked at those top 100 shows, and we wanted to see how many of them are actually baking in ads, not using the YouTube AdSense, but how many are actually embedding their ads natively in there. So what we found is probably essentially that virtually all are baking in their ads into their content, that 90% of the YouTube top 100 shows, we found ads that they're putting in there, not like the ads that you can easily skip that YouTube puts in there, ones that are actually embedded in part of the content where YouTube doesn't make any money off those, it's just entirely sold through the creator and that they insert in there. And we found on average that of these top 100 shows, about 4% of these YouTube videos are embedded ads. So a pretty sizable portion. And to put even a quick number on, what this really is, so just looking at the top 100 YouTube podcasts alone, we estimate based on those numbers on the prior slide that roughly $500 million per year, a pretty decent fraction of the overall maybe $2.5 billion podcast spend per year goes to this embedded, these embedded ads in YouTube videos. So it's a pretty significant portion that has been quite a big question mark for how to measure. And we do estimate that this number could probably be doubled, if not more, perhaps more. We put 350 plus there for how big it could grow if we actually had proper measurement. And I believe, Giles, you had a...
Yeah, that 350 million number comes from a research study that we did at Oxford Road called What Brands Want, which will be released in the coming month or so. 43% of marketers in that study said that they would increase their podcast spending by at least 25% if they could measure the YouTube component of their campaign, the same way they could measure the audio component. So, as Pete said, we estimate $350 million potentially are on the table. It could be significantly more than that if we could bring better measurement to YouTube. So in terms of how YouTube is typically measured by marketers, and many of you no doubt are familiar with this, but there's no ability to pixel a podcast ad in the YouTube environment. And typically, many advertisers are using a regular tracking pixel in an audio ad that then matches back to activity on their website, so then they can see who heard the podcast ad in audio and who took an action on the website. That's not possible in YouTube. And so that's the cause of this big measurement gap. And so what advertisers tend to do is they will use a promo code, or they will use a survey, which really means often just a 1-question or 2-question survey on the client's website. It says, how did you hear about us? And there is one new piece of technology that is coming to market that we call passive monitoring, which also presents new possibilities for evaluating the effectiveness of YouTube podcasting. Just going to spend a moment to talk about that because we think it's really interesting. Actually, before I show you the data, let me explain about the passive monitoring. So how it works is people sign up for a panel. It's not unlike the Nielsen TV panel where they measure TV ratings. You sign up for a panel, and when you do that, you're incentivized. And when you do that, they install a bit of software on your computer, and that tracks your browsing activity. And so if you hear a certain ad and then you show up on a certain website, the passive monitoring can actually track that behavior similarly to how Pixel does. But it will also be able to track visits to YouTube and specific YouTube episodes where there's a podcast, for example, and then subsequent activity on a website. So this passive monitoring technology is new to the industry, and it also represents some really interesting promise for trying to hold YouTube accountable for how well their impressions perform. And what we saw when we did that study is this was among a client who we looked at about 15 to 20 YouTube episodes with about 3.5 million impressions in total. And we looked at the people who were exposed to those episodes. And then we saw how much did they visit this client's website after that exposure, and what was their visitation rate before that exposure. It was pre-post analysis. And we found that after exposure, there was an 8% lift in how much traffic was going to the client's website after being exposed to the YouTube podcast ads. So to our knowledge, that was the first time anyone had ever been able to put a number on YouTube measurement for podcasts. And the other interesting thing about this, which I think just also worth mentioning, we were able to see using this technology also activity on the whole categories websites. And in aggregate, in the pre versus post periods, the rest of the category was down 4%. So that 8% lift is even higher and more impactful.
So here comes the fun part. So
Audience
if you were,
participation.
what's that?
Audience participation.
Audience
people.
participation. So if you're an advertiser and you could have 1 million podcast downloads to promote your product, or you could have 1 million YouTube views, and you want to drive purchases on your website, who here would choose to take the 1 million views over the podcast downloads?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Okay.
6, 7, 8, 9. Okay.
And who here would take the 1 million podcast downloads over the YouTube views? All right, so it's pretty mixed, maybe a slight majority for YouTube. So, okay, that's great to know.
So what we have here is a chart showing what we're calling code rate, but you can also think of it as a regular response rate. Essentially what that is the number of promo codes that you're generating for an advertiser divided by the number of impressions. So how efficient is the media in driving promo codes to the advertiser's website? And you've got two colors on this chart. In blue, you've got episodes that are showing up as simulcast, i.e. there is an audio component and a video component. The episode is also uploaded onto YouTube. And then in the pink, you've got audio-only episodes. And this is a histogram. It's basically a bell curve. You're probably all familiar with this, but just in case, the y-axis shows the frequency. So if you think of this in terms of the height of humans, there's like, most of the people are about 5'9" in the middle, and then you've got a few people who are like 7 foot, and a few people who are 4'5". So it's showing the distribution of code rate, of response rate. So how efficient is the advertising? And the really important thing to notice is how the pink area is shifted to the right of the blue area. We're really giving you a kind of inside baseball look at the data here. So
to the right means better.
Yeah, sorry. So you've got low response rates on the left, higher response rates on the right. So because that pink area is shifted over to the right, that's showing like your average conversion rate, your average code rate for the audio is noticeably different from the simulcast campaigns.
So to just jump in here, so yeah, to recap, we cannot pixel YouTube data. We have a bit of panel-based data, but for the purpose of this analysis, we looked at promo code use in Heidi House post-purchase survey data to then try and compare the two. So we were focused on, in our analysis, on specifically those two, and in the data Giles just showed, we looked overall at a high level, just simulcast campaigns that have a mixture of audio and video, and then only compared those to pure audio campaigns. And we did see that the pure audio campaigns do seem to redeem codes at a higher rate. So now, next, what we want to do is we want to dive in actually to those simulcast campaigns that have a mixture of audio and video and see, does the trend hold? So if a campaign is 1 million impressions, if it has 90% audio, will that still have a higher promo code redemption rate than a campaign that is 90% video? So looking at within simulcasts, does this trend still hold, since we did see it as a whole for simulcast versus audio? So we split out campaigns that are simulcast into buckets, as you can see here. So ones that are all the way up to 90 or 100% audio. So that means maybe 900,000 podcast downloads and 100K YouTube views, to then the other end of the spectrum where they're purely YouTube. And then what we do is we then analyze how many codes each of these buckets would get, and then we'll get into survey data in a second. But so now we're diving in to simulcast to see if that trend holds as well.
So here's some data from one example advertiser, shown exactly the way Pete just explained it. So from left to right, you've got more audio impressions, or all audio impressions, and as you go further to the right, you have more YouTube impressions in the mix. And you can see here in this advertiser, there's a very clear and noticeable trend that the rate of code redemption is significantly higher when there are more audio impressions. So that corroborates what we saw in the histogram, that suggests at a macro level, the audio impressions seem to be working harder than the video impressions. Now, one of the challenges of this type of analysis is when an advertiser is driving a promo code, how good is the offer? What's the attractiveness of that promo code? And there are many other important factors as well, like how expensive is the product? All of these things are going to have a huge impact on the rate of redemption, and every advertiser obviously is completely different. And so aggregating results across the whole data set is somewhat challenging. So what we ended up doing was breaking these trends down across all of the advertisers in the sample that we looked at, which is about 20 to 25 advertisers. And this is what the aggregate results look like across those 25 advertisers. And we're showing the same, decile pattern, like the 10 groups.
Right, so if the left side of the graph is higher, that's where the simulcast campaigns were more audio. So if audio is doing better, the left side of the graph is higher. And if YouTube is doing better, the right side is higher. So if the line slopes down from the left to the right, it means audio was doing better for that advertiser. So you can clearly see it's not exactly the case for every single one, but on average, though, we do.
I think we had 18, maybe 19 sloping downwards, and 5 sloping up, but one of them was missing some data points in the middle. So given you've got 18 showing that the audio impressions seem to be working harder and only 4 in reverse, that certainly seems to be a strong indicator in favor of audio. And in aggregate, across the whole data set, we found that pure audio campaigns, if they drove, say, 100 promo codes in the campaign for 1 million impressions, the simulcast campaigns would only drive 66 promo code redemption, so 34% difference there. That's a really material difference in the effectiveness of video versus audio. Now, that's somewhat controversial, and we were quite surprised about it and actually ran over the data several times. We'll talk a bit more, I think, about the sort of implications and some of the potential challenges to that in a moment. We're going to look at surveys first. Anything to add before we go on, Pete?
So we were pretty skeptical at first, because I had always thought for the longest time YouTube views would do better, because a view, they watched at least some of it, unlike a download, which you don't really know. There's a visual component to video. So it sort of was a bit confusing, and we weren't totally sure. So then we wanted to bring in another data set besides just promos to see if was there something weird about promos. So here's where we decided to bring in post-purchase survey data to see if we can see something similar or different.
And just to bring that to life, as I explained earlier, you get to the website, you're ready to check out, and when you're about to check out, they ask, how did you hear about us? And you make a selection or you type in the name of a podcast. Just a quick pitch for the Oxford Road newsletter. This is a screenshot from our website. So please sign up for the influencer, one of the best reads in the industry, promo code Giles. So when we looked at the survey data analysis, we actually looked at just the pure YouTube bucket and the pure audio bucket and then the simulcast bucket in between. Broke that all out. Here we're looking at essentially the same metric. We're calling it survey rate, but it's the same type of measure of response. The number of survey responses indicating podcast drove my purchase, divided by the number of impressions. So how effective are those impressions? How effective is that media in driving survey responses? And as you can see, again, at a macro level, there's a pretty meaningful difference, particularly between the audio-only and the YouTube-only parts of this data set. Now, we had less data available on survey responses than we did promo code responses. So it ended up being a smaller data set to work with once we broke the data into the 10 chunks of 0 to 100, all the way through to 50-50 to 100 to 0. We ended up with 7 advertisers that had data in every single decile. We put them all on this one chart here so that you can see what the trends look like, because really it's about the trend overall, as Pete was explaining. When they're going left to right, that's an indicator that the audio is working better. So of these 6 clients, 6 of them are trending down very, very distinctively and clearly. One of them is completely flat and showing no difference between audio and video. But again, this corroborates what we saw with the codes, and that it's very much the same type of trend. Anything to add? And looking at those 7 advertisers individually, this is showing we calculated what their response rates were for the audio impressions and for the YouTube impressions. And this is showing on an individual advertiser basis the difference between the audio impressions and the YouTube impressions. So you can see the one advertiser that had the flat line, that's the second one. There's almost no difference there. One of these advertisers had a really huge difference, and then most of the others are in that sort of 10 to 30% range. So obviously it does vary by advertiser. We talked about, every brand and company and product and advertising campaign is different, so there's going to be variability in results. The difference here is last time we saw 34% lower response for YouTube. Here we're seeing 18% lower response. So why might this be the case? We have discussed it quite a lot internally, and this is the first time this type of analysis has been done. So maybe with more data, we might see more refinements to the results. But accepting them at face value for now, because we do see that consistency across many advertisers and across both of these different types of response mechanics. We know, and we talk a lot in the industry about how podcast is very much a lean-in medium. It's self-selecting medium. People are actively choosing and listening and really paying attention. YouTube tends to be more of a lean back, possibly casual browsing environment. In YouTube, there's a lot of competition for attention. There's a lot of skipping. There's a lot of jumping around for content. There are a lot of thumbnails attracting attention and trying to move you on to the next piece of content. In the audio environment, the host-read ads are more prominent. People are focused on the audio feed. Perhaps they're multitasking, but they're hearing all of that podcast. They're mostly hearing the host-read ads. There are low skipping rates of ads in podcasts, which I'm sure you're all aware of. There's no visual cues to distract you. And also, I think the user expectations part is very important. There is some conditioning amongst the audio podcast listener to respond to ad campaigns with promo codes. We've been hearing these messages for 20 years now. It's not so much the case in YouTube. People are not so much conditioned in a YouTube environment to respond to a promo code. So that could be a very meaningful explanation. And it raises an important question about how much can these results be transferred generally to say, make a general statement about, well, YouTube responds less well than audio environments for podcast. If we measured it with a pixel, would we see the same type of results? We don't know that because we can't put a pixel in there. More about that in a moment. But I don't think we can necessarily assume that these results would transfer. I think there is some degree to which they are specific to promo code response mechanics and survey response mechanics, but we'd need to do more work on that.
So yeah, to recap, I was definitely pretty surprised about this, since I had always thought YouTube views would probably do better. But then after thinking about it from my perspective, my main hypothesis is that podcasting is more of a lean-in medium, as Giles is saying, that if you want to listen to a podcast, it's kind of a pain. You got to go to Apple Podcasts and you probably subscribe to the host. But on YouTube, you're on YouTube and other random videos are popping up from creators you don't even know, just more easily coming into your feed there. For instance, think to Donald Trump on Rogan. How many people who were watching that really were maybe Rogan fans? Maybe just a bunch of new people came in who didn't probably have a ton of loyalty to Rogan. They just wanted to see that episode. And if you're gonna share a podcast too with a friend, I'll probably share it on YouTube just because I don't know what app they have, how to timestamp it to the moment. So I think YouTube just lends itself more to sharing and discovery. So the theory in casual listening. So that's my theory, that the podcast listeners are just more into the host. They're more loyal to the host, and so are going to be more receptive when that host promotes a product, thereby giving audio downloads a bit more value than a YouTube view, which could be a bit more casual. And so, yeah, for that, at Podscribe, we've had YouTube modeling for some time, where we'll model the performance on YouTube views from the audio performance of the podcast, where we'll take it at the exact same rate. So to account for this, we've released a slider where actually you can adjust your modeling based on what you think best. So we may be updating our defaults later, but this certainly has called us to think more about that, and I think that's our next slide.
And just on the ability to adjust that modeling, we've shown these two data points, 34% difference between simulcast and audio-only campaigns, and 18% difference between video and audio impressions. There is a range of response, as you can see. There are lots of different ways of looking at the data. There's no one sort of perfect answer, and you might pick a number in the middle, or you might pick a more conservative number. When you're sort of thinking about how do I want to manage this for my business. So having a slider there actually is a nice way to handle.
And some brands too maybe need that visual component. Maybe maybe they better understand how to use visual ads and they get product placement better, or their product needs it. So I don't think it's certainly for every advertiser. This is more of just an aggregate observation.
So what do we recommend brands do about this? So first of all, it depends how you're measuring podcasts on YouTube right now. Now, what a lot of people are doing, we believe, and we see a lot of our clients do, is they are estimating the number of YouTube impressions from their campaign, and they are applying the same response rates that they see in audio, which typically they get from a pixel, and they apply that response rate to the video impressions. And that's been best practice in the industry up till this point. It's been the best we've had. We've never really had any insights into YouTube's individual performance before, which is why we've been doing all these initiatives this year to start to get more specific insights about YouTube. So if you are assuming that YouTube video has the same response as audio, you might want to adjust your assumptions as per that slider. You might want to adjust any MMMs or MTA models that you have that are making assumptions about how responsive these different channels are. That could make your optimization and your attribution significantly more accurate. So adjusting your response models is definitely something worth looking at. And then reconsidering the media plan and pricing structures. If I was talking with any really hard-nosed media negotiators, and I know there are some out there, they might reconsider the value of a YouTube impression. If they're paying the same price as they are for an audio impression, they might look again at that. Or if you're planning, and we take the point about skipping as a sort of significant potential factor in YouTube's softer performance, perhaps you push more heavily for pre-roll ads in a YouTube environment. So definitely looking again at the media plan and the pricing structures that you've got in place for the plan would be really advisable based on the data that we got here. And then finally, participate. Please join us. Like, we're really working on a concerted effort to move the industry, unite the industry, to really sort of put pressure on the market for standardization in measurement. The lack of ability to put a pixel in a YouTube environment or in a Spotify video environment really hampers advertisers' trust in the medium. It restricts budgets. We're hearing, in fact, I'd like to hear about this from you because you were talking about this morning, but some really big brands holding back from being in podcasting at all, or at least in the YouTube part of podcasting, because they can't measure it and they don't trust it and therefore they don't want to be involved. Do you have anything to add on that?
To tie it back to the beginning, the biggest takeaway for me from this is that YouTube, being able to pixel YouTube, how big of a difference that would make to creators and everybody in the industry. We can work our way around and back into the performance of YouTube from these metrics and try to gauge the value of a view in aggregate. But really, I mean, the best case scenario is that if that we're able to have more data from YouTube, and that really everybody would benefit most from that, because we've certainly heard many stories of buyers who just say, oh, we can't, buy a simulcast because we can't measure the YouTube views on it. And, and then how many buyers are there who are buying them, but would buy a lot more if they could measure. So there's certainly quite a toll on the industry due to this lack of data.
So finally, we are working on activating the industry. This is a QR code. You may be familiar with this cutting-edge technology. Please feel free to scan it and sign our petition, it's not really a petition, but it's a sign up to be involved, to express interest in this movement towards driving better metrics for the industry generally. With the encroachment of video podcasting, it's changing the whole industry, and for brands, it's the brand dollars that are really funding everything for all of us. And so if brands are being discouraged from coming into the market, if they're discouraged from expanding and growing, that is a risk and a threat to all of us. So we really encourage you all to join us, to unite. Let's put pressure on the market. Let's have the market come together and work on initiatives to drive standardization in metrics of all kinds. It's not just about attribution, it's also about measuring downloads and impressions. We've talked here about YouTube views and podcast downloads. They're completely different metrics. And we're hearing from creators that it looks like their show is tanking, but actually their show isn't tanking. They're just looking at their downloads. And if you incorporate the YouTube views, they're actually doing better than they ever were. So it's also about standardization in impression reporting. How do we count a view? How do we count a play? All of these types of things. And you hopefully will be hearing much more about this soon from the Oxford Road team and from Podscribe too. So thank you all so much. Whoops.
Any questions?
1 minute for questions.
What is a view? In other words, if I'm scrolling through YouTube and the video is on my screen for a second and I just scroll past it, is that a view?
So to my knowledge, Google hasn't really published any clear definition that I'm really aware of to what a view is. So if you play it for 2 seconds and then stop, I don't know. You were thinking maybe it's 30 seconds.
I think
I'm not sure.
there's a 30-second requirement. I think that the video must be playing for 30 seconds, and then it will be counted as a view. It's not really my area, but I know that often there are certain considerations about how much of the video is actually viewable on the screen. Like if it's only 50% visible to you, like would it actually count? So there are some considerations around that. But I think the fundamental is 30 seconds.
Well, that makes sense then, because I was thinking, why could it be less valuable? And then, well, if every time it shows up on my screen, it's a view, of course it's less valuable. Yeah. I'm not watching half of what goes across my screen.
No, they have to press play, and they have to be watching for at least 30 seconds for it to count as a view. But they could then skip to another video, and they've only been there for 30 seconds. So.
Sure.
See me afterwards.
I was just wondering if, geolocation was taken into consideration at all. Like if a product wasn't available outside the U.S., like the percent of geolocation outside.
No, that
was taken
it
into
wasn't.
account?
It wasn't, and that was one factor we were thinking that could be a factor. You know, if a lot of these YouTube views are coming internationally, maybe we need to look at only the U.S. version of those. But then a challenge too is we have a way to get the country breakdown of the views at a channel level, but then to get it per a video level, I think we need publishers to provide that data. So I think that could be that's definitely a good area to look into more, like how many of these YouTube views are coming internationally where the product might not even be available.
Yeah, because the average show would have probably about 15% difference in the U.S. consumption from the RSS to the YouTube.
Interesting.
The same show. And I'm very curious about the quality of those baked-in ads. Was the host on screen? Was it just a static banner? Was that taken into account at all?
For now, we just looked at grouped all host endorsements together. But I would bet, you know, if the host does it really well, if they wear the hat and, you know, try it out and do something visually, I think there could be a very good chance that might do better, you know, than an audio one. So in a bucket, yeah, they were lumped together in a bucket. But I do think it certainly could be possible, you know, a very well done one.
And the question about geo, I mean, it's a great question, and it really, again, highlights the point that we don't have access to the data from YouTube. And if we did, we could get much better quality answers for the industry. But we're sort of hacking this all together right now. So, you know, this is what we've got. But
Good questions.
all right. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. Two most precious commodities.